The badge that changed everything. Margaret adjusted the pearls at her throat one last time before stepping out of the limousine. The June afternoon stretched golden across the manicured grounds of Rosewood Manor, where her granddaughter's wedding was about to unfold like something from a fairy tale. At 72, Margaret had learned to find joy in these moments, watching the next generation bloom, even as her own autumn deepened. The venue was everything Sarah had dreamed of. White roses climbed the stone archways, and crystal chandeliers caught the light filtering through tall windows. Margaret had insisted on the best for her granddaughter, just as she always had. The deposit alone could have bought a small car, but what was money for if not for family? Grandmother! Sarah rushed over, her silk train flowing behind her like sea foam. Even in her wedding dress, she managed to look ethereal rather than overwhelmed. You look beautiful. Thank you so much for everything. Margaret squeezed her granddaughter's hands, careful not to disturb the delicate lace sleeves. You're the beautiful one today, sweetheart. Your grandfather would have been so proud. For a moment, Sarah's eyes misted. I wish he could have walked me down the aisle. He is here, Margaret said softly. In every choice you've made, every kind word you speak. That's his legacy. Sarah hugged her gently, then pulled back with that bright smile that had lit up Margaret's world since the girl was born. I should go check on the flowers one more time. The coordinator wants everyone to get their name tags from the welcome table. Name tags? Margaret hadn't expected such formality at a family wedding, but I supposed it helped the photographer and staff identify everyone. She made her way to the elegant table draped in ivory silk, where a young woman in a headset was organizing small badges. Mrs. Collins, here you are. The coordinator handed her a badge with a practiced smile. Please make sure to wear this throughout the reception. Margaret glanced down at the badge, expecting to see Margaret Collins, grandmother of the bride, or perhaps simply family. Instead, she stared at words that hit her like a physical blow. The old lady who pays for everything. The world seemed to tilt. Margaret read it again, certain she'd misunderstood, but there it was, printed in elegant script that matched the invitations she'd helped choose and pay for. Excuse me, she said, her voice barely steady. I think there's been a mistake. The coordinator checked her list. No mistake, ma'am. That's what was requested for your badge. Margaret's fingers trembled as she held the small rectangle. Around her, other family members were arriving and collecting their own badges. She caught glimpses of uncle of the bride, college friend, beloved cousin. Normal designations that spoke of relationships, of love, of connection, not of being reduced to a wallet with legs. Margaret, there you are. Her son David approached with his wife Linda at his side. Both were impeccably dressed. David in a tailored suit that cost more than many people made in a month, Linda in a designer dress that Margaret suspected had been charged to the credit card she'd given them for wedding emergencies. David's badge read, Father of the Bride. Linda's said, Mother of the Bride. Both perfectly appropriate. Getting your badge, I see, Linda said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They turned out nice, didn't they? Margaret held up her badge. Did you see what this says? David barely glanced at it. Well, it's accurate, isn't it? Come on, Mom, don't be so sensitive. It's just a joke. A joke? Margaret's voice came out sharper than she'd intended. Reducing me to nothing but a source of money is a joke?
You're overreacting, Linda said, adjusting her own badge proudly. Everyone knows you're generous. It's practically your defining characteristic. Margaret stared at her daughter-in-law. 25 years of marriage to David, and Linda still treated her like an outsider. But this felt different. This felt calculated. My defining characteristic? Margaret repeated slowly. Well, yes, David said, already looking around the room as if he'd rather be anywhere else. You've always been the one with the open checkbook. Remember when Linda and I needed help with the down payment on the house? When the kids needed college tuition? When we wanted to take that cruise last year? You never hesitated. Each example felt like another small cut. Margaret had given freely, joyfully even, because she loved them, because she wanted to help.
Because Henry had left her well provided for, and she believed in sharing good fortune with family. But apparently, that's all she was now. A checkbook, an ATM in pearls. I need some air, Margaret said, turning away before they could see the tears threatening to spill. She found herself on the manor's terrace, looking out over gardens that reminded her of the ones she and Henry had tended together for 43 years. The irony wasn't lost on her. Even this moment of solitude was happening at a venue she'd paid for. Grandma Maggie? She turned to find her grandson Michael approaching. At 26, he had his grandfather's gentle eyes and the kind of steady presence that made people feel safe. His badge simply read, "Grandson of the bride," but he wasn't looking at hers. "Everything okay? You look upset." Margaret considered deflecting, putting on the brave face she'd perfected over the years. Instead, she held up her badge. Michael read it, and his expression darkened. "What the hell is this?" "Language, Michael." "No, seriously, Grandma. This is messed up. Who thought this was appropriate?" Margaret sank onto one of the stone benches, suddenly feeling every one of her 72 years. "Your father says it's just a joke, that I'm being too sensitive." Michael sat beside her, his jaw tight with anger. "It's not a joke, it's cruel." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "How long has this been going on?" "What do you mean?" "This attitude, treating you like you're just there to pay for things." Margaret thought about it. When had it started? After Henry's death 3 years ago? Or had it been building slowly, so gradually she hadn't noticed until it culminated in this moment? I think it's been happening for a while. I just didn't want to see it." Michael took her hand. "Grandpa Henry left you well off, didn't he?" "Very well off," Margaret admitted. Henry had been a successful architect, and they'd invested wisely over the years. But that was never the point. I helped because I loved all of you. And they took advantage of that love. The words hung between them, heavy with truth. Margaret had been so busy giving, so focused on being the generous matriarch, that she'd lost sight of whether her generosity was appreciated or simply expected. "Mrs. Collins?" The wedding coordinator appeared on the terrace. "We're ready for the family photos." Margaret stood, smoothing her dress. She'd worn her best outfit today, a navy blue silk ensemble that Henry had always said brought out her eyes. Now she wondered if anyone would even notice what she looked like, as long as the checks kept coming. The photo session was a blur of forced smiles in arranged poses. Margaret found herself positioned in the back row, while David and Linda flanked Sarah in the center. The photographer called out instructions, and Margaret dutifully smiled when told to smile, looked here when told to look here. "Beautiful family," the photographer commented during a break. "And, Mrs. Collins, thank you for making this all possible. Sarah mentioned you funded the whole wedding." Heat crept up Margaret's neck. She glanced at David and Linda, but they were busy fussing with their hair, acting as if they hadn't heard. "I was happy to help," Margaret said quietly. "Well, you're very generous. Not many grandparents would do so much." The ceremony itself was lovely. Sarah looked radiant as she walked down the aisle, and her young husband James gazed at her with such pure adoration that Margaret felt her heart lift despite everything. This was what mattered: love, commitment, the joining of two lives. But even during the vows, Margaret found herself thinking about the badge pinned to her dress, about how she'd been introduced to other guests throughout the afternoon. This is Margaret, Sarah's grandmother. She's the one who made all this possible, not, "This is Margaret who raised 3 children and worked as a librarian for 30 years and volunteers at the animal shelter." Just the woman who paid. The reception was in full swing when Linda approached her at the bar. "Margaret, we need to talk." Linda's voice had an edge to it, and she'd clearly had several glasses of champagne. "After the honeymoon, David and I think it's time we discussed your living situation." "My living situation?" That big house of yours, it's too much for one person. All those stairs, that huge yard. What if something happens to you? Margaret set down her wine glass. The house is fine, Linda. I have a cleaning service and a lawn care company. I'm perfectly capable of... But it's not just about capability, Linda interrupted. It's about being practical. That house must be worth what? 800,000, maybe more? That's money just sitting there, tied up in property you don't really need. The pieces clicked into place with devastating clarity. This wasn't about Margaret's safety or convenience. It was about money. Again, you want me to sell my home. We want you to be smart about your assets, David said, joining the conversation. Think about it, Mom. You could get a nice little condo, something manageable. Use the proceeds to secure your future. My future is secure, David. But what about unexpected expenses, medical bills, long-term care? Linda leaned in closer. And frankly, what about helping the family when we need it? Sarah and James will want to buy a house eventually. Michael is talking about graduate school. There are so many better uses for that money than keeping it tied up in a house you rattle around in by yourself. Margaret looked from her son to her daughter-in-law, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time, the eager gleam in their eyes, the way they'd cornered her at her granddaughter's wedding of all places to discuss her finances. I see, she said quietly. We're not trying to pressure you, David said quickly. We just want what's best for everyone. Everyone. The family, Linda clarified. It would make things so much easier if we could consolidate resources. Maybe I could help you manage your investments. David has some ideas about portfolio diversification. Target? She thought about Henry, about the will reading 3 years ago. He'd left everything to her, with provisions for the children after her death. But there had been something else. Something the lawyer had mentioned that she'd barely paid attention to at the time. Something about protective clauses. Grandmother? Sarah appeared in the mirror behind her, still radiant, but looking concerned. Are you all right? You seemed upset during the reception. Margaret turned around, taking in her granddaughter's worried expression. Sarah, did you know what my name tag was going to say? Sarah's face crumpled. I'm so sorry. I had no idea until I saw it. Mom said she was taking care of all the name tags, and when I asked her about yours specifically, she said it would be something sweet. I should have insisted on seeing them first. It's not your fault, sweetheart. But it is. This is my wedding, and you've been so generous. And now you've been hurt, and... Sarah's voice broke. I feel terrible. Margaret pulled her granddaughter into a hug. This is your wedding day. Your special day. Don't let this cast a shadow on it. But what they wrote, what they called you, it's not true. You're not just someone who pays for things. You're the woman who taught me to bake cookies and read me stories and held me when I cried over my first heartbreak. You're the strongest person I know, and the kindest, and I love you so much. Tears Margaret had been holding back finally spilled over. I love you too, darling girl. They stood there for a moment, holding each other in the elegant bathroom, while the sounds of celebration continued outside. What are you going to do? Sarah asked softly. Margaret pulled back, wiping her eyes carefully to preserve what was left of her makeup. I'm going to figure some things out. The rest of the reception passed in a haze. Margaret smiled and congratulated people and made small talk. But part of her was already somewhere else, thinking about phone calls she needed to make, documents she needed to review. Michael found her near the end of the evening. Can I drive you home, Grandma? That would be nice. They rode in comfortable silence for most of the trip, the city lights streaming past the windows of Michael's modest sedan. Finally, as they pulled into her driveway, Margaret spoke. Michael, do you remember your grandfather's will reading? Some of it. I was pretty young and, honestly, legal stuff went over my head. There was something the lawyer mentioned, something about protective clauses. I need to call him tomorrow and find out exactly what your grandfather put in that will. Michael turned off the engine and looked at her. Grandma, are you okay? Really okay? Margaret considered the question. Was she okay? Her son and daughter-in-law saw her as nothing more than a source of funding. They wanted her to sell her home and hand over control of her finances. They'd allowed her to be publicly humiliated at her granddaughter's wedding with a name tag that reduced her entire identity to her bank account. But she was also seeing clearly for the first time in years, and she was angry. Not the helpless, hurt anger of earlier in the day, but a clean, focused anger that felt almost energizing. I'm going to be okay, but I think some changes are coming. The next morning, Margaret called Henry's lawyer, Robert Chen, first thing. She'd known Robert for years. He'd handled their estate planning, their business affairs, even helped them navigate the complexities of Henry's architectural firm when he decided to retire. Margaret, good to hear from you. How are you doing? I've been better, Robert. I need to ask you about something in Henry's will. You mentioned some protective clauses at the reading, but I didn't pay much attention at the time. Can you refresh my memory? Has something happened? Margaret found herself telling him about the previous day, about the badge, about David and Linda's pressure regarding her house and finances. As she talked, she could hear Robert making notes.
I see, he said when she finished. Margaret, I think you need to come in. Today, if possible. There are some things we should discuss in person. 2 hours later, Margaret sat in Robert's office, a cup of tea cooling in her hands as he spread documents across his desk. Henry was very specific about these provisions, Robert said. He was concerned about protecting you, not just financially, but from exploitation. He'd seen it happen to other widows, family members who suddenly became very interested in their inheritance, who pressured or manipulated elderly relatives. He never mentioned any of this to me. He hoped it would never be necessary, but he wanted to be prepared. Robert pulled out a particular document. There are several clauses here that might interest you. First, if any family member attempts to coerce you into selling your primary residence or transferring significant assets before your death, they forfeit their inheritance. Margaret stared at the document. Forfeit their inheritance? Completely. Henry defined coercion very broadly. Public humiliation that suggests you're valued only for your money, pressure to sell your home, attempts to gain control of your finances without your explicit request for help. Margaret thought about the badge, about Linda's speech at the bar, about David's comment that she always comes around. There's more, Robert continued. If any beneficiary shows what Henry termed a pattern of treating Margaret as primarily a source of financial support rather than as a beloved family member, they can be removed from the will entirely. How would that be determined? Henry left it to my discretion, in consultation with you. He trusted both of us to recognize genuine care versus opportunistic behavior. Margaret set down her teacup with shaking hands. Robert, does what happened yesterday, does that qualify? The badge alone might be borderline, depending on intent, but combined with the immediate pressure about your house and finances, Robert nodded gravely. I think Henry would consider that exactly the kind of behavior he was trying to protect you from. What happens to their portion of the inheritance if they're removed from the will? It goes to other family members who have shown genuine care for your well-being. In this case, that would likely be Michael and Sarah. Margaret was quiet for a long time, processing this information. Henry had known. Somehow he'd known that this day might come, and he'd tried to protect her even from beyond the grave. What do I need to do? She asked finally. Nothing yet. But I recommend we document recent events carefully. And, Margaret, you should know that Henry also left you a letter to be opened only if these clauses ever became relevant. A letter? Robert unlocked a file cabinet and withdrew a sealed envelope with Margaret's name written in Henry's familiar handwriting. He asked me to give this to you if we ever had this conversation. With trembling fingers, Margaret opened the envelope and unfolded the single page inside. My dearest Margaret,
If you're reading this, then I wasn't wrong to worry. I know you're probably feeling confused, hurt, maybe even guilty for having these suspicions about our family. Don't. You are the most generous, loving person I've ever known. And if someone is taking advantage of that generosity, it's not a failing on your part. It's a failing on theirs. I've seen too many good people in their golden years lose their independence, their security, and their dignity to family members who see inheritance as something to be claimed early, rather than earned through love and respect. I won't let that happen to you. You are not just a bank account with legs. You are not just someone who pays for things. You are an extraordinary woman who raised 3 children, built a career, volunteered in your community, and made every life you touched better. You are my partner in everything, my best friend, and the love of my life. Don't let anyone convince you that your worth is measured by your willingness to write checks. Don't let them pressure you into giving up the home we built together, the independence you've earned, or the security you deserve. You are enough, exactly as you are. You always have been. All my love, always and forever. Henry. P.S. I've left specific instructions with Robert. Trust him and trust yourself. Margaret was crying by the time she finished reading, but these weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, of validation, of feeling understood and protected even now. Take your time, Robert said gently. This is a lot to process. Margaret wiped her eyes and folded the letter carefully. Robert, I want you to document everything that happened yesterday. I want an official record. I'll prepare a detailed report. In the meantime, I recommend you don't make any major changes to your living situation or finances. And Margaret, if the pressure continues or escalates, call me immediately. That evening, Margaret was in her kitchen preparing dinner when the doorbell rang. Through the window, she could see David and Linda on her porch, both looking determined. She opened the door, but didn't invite them in. Mom, we need to talk, David said, stepping forward as if to enter. Margaret didn't move aside. About what? About yesterday. Linda feels like you were cold to her at the reception. Margaret looked at her daughter-in-law. Cold? When we were trying to have a reasonable conversation about your living situation, you just walked away. It was rude. The audacity took Margaret's breath away. You cornered me at my granddaughter's wedding to pressure me about selling my house, and you think I was rude? We're your family, David said. We're trying to help. By humiliating me with that badge? By treating me like nothing more than a source of money? David sighed dramatically. We've been over this. It was a joke, Mom. You're being way too sensitive. And the house? The house is a practical matter. You're getting older, whether you want to admit it or not. What happens when you fall down those stairs? What happens when you can't maintain such a large property? We're trying to plan ahead. For whose benefit? For everyone's, David said. Look, Mom, I'm going to be direct here. You're sitting on a fortune, living alone in a house you don't need, while your family struggles. Linda and I are still paying off Sarah's student loans that you couldn't help with. I paid for Sarah's entire education. Her undergraduate degree, not her master's program. Margaret stared at them. Sarah had never mentioned needing help with a master's program. She decided not to pursue a master's degree. She went directly into her job at the marketing firm. David and Linda exchanged a look. Well, there were other expenses, David said quickly. The point is, we could use your help, and you're being selfish by hoarding resources. Selfish, Margaret repeated. Yes, Linda said, warming to the theme. You have no idea what it's like trying to make ends meet while you live in luxury. Do you know what our mortgage payment is? Do you know how much it costs to maintain a lifestyle appropriate to David's position at the firm? Margaret knew exactly what their lifestyle cost because she'd been subsidizing it for years. The emergency car repairs that coincided with Linda wanting a newer model. The unexpected home improvement projects that happened right after Linda saw something she liked in a magazine. The family vacation expenses that somehow always exceeded what they'd budgeted. I think you should leave, Margaret said quietly. Mom, David started. I think you should leave, and I think you should think very carefully about how you're treating me. Are you threatening us? Linda's voice rose, Because if you think you can just cut us off, Linda, David grabbed his wife's arm. Let's go. As they walked away, Margaret heard Linda hiss, "She can't just cut us off. She won't. She's too weak." Margaret closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. Too weak. Is that really what they thought of her? Her phone rang. Michael. Grandma, I just got off the phone with Sarah. She's really upset about yesterday and she wanted me to check on you. I'm all right, sweetheart. Are you? Because Sarah said Dad and Linda went over there tonight to talk to you. Margaret found herself telling Michael about the conversation, about their demands and accusations, about being called selfish for not subsidizing their lifestyle sufficiently. That's it, Michael said when she finished. I'm coming over. You don't need to. Yes, I do. I'll be there in 20 minutes. True to his word, Michael arrived with takeout Chinese food and a determined expression. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone, he said, unpacking containers of sweet and sour chicken and fried rice. They ate at Margaret's kitchen table, the same table where she'd served countless family dinners over the years, where she'd helped her children with homework and listened to their problems and celebrated their successes. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course. How much money have you given them over the years? Dad and Linda, I mean. Margaret considered the question. I've never kept a running total. It wasn't about keeping score. But approximately. Margaret thought about it. The house down payment, the car loans she co-signed and ended up paying when they defaulted, the vacation expenses, the emergency home improvement repairs that happened right after Linda saw something she liked in a magazine, the business investment that David had needed for a venture that never materialized, Sarah's college tuition and living expenses, probably close to $300,000, she said finally. Maybe more. Whistle, Michael whistled low. And they want you to sell your house so they can have access to more? They say it's for practical reasons, that I'm too old to live here alone. Bullshit. Michael rarely swore around her, so the word carried extra weight. Sorry, Grandma, but that's what it is. You're one of the most capable people I know. You drive, you volunteer, you manage your own finances. You maintain this house beautifully. There's nothing about your age or health that requires you to downsize. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Thank you for saying that. I'm saying it because it's true, and I'm saying it because someone needs to. Michael was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something? Always. I've been watching this happen for a while now. The way they treat you, the way they act like you owe them something just for existing. It makes me sick. Michael. No, let me finish. You raised Dad and Uncle Robert and Aunt Jenny, right? And Uncle Robert lives in California and never asks for anything, and Aunt Jenny lives in Seattle and checks on you every week, but never asks for money. It's just Dad who acts like he's your personal ATM. Margaret had noticed that too, but hearing Michael say it made it seem more real somehow. I think, Michael said carefully, that they've gotten so used to your generosity that they see it as an obligation rather than a gift. And now they're angry because you're not being generous fast enough or in the way they want. That night, Margaret lay in bed in the house she and Henry had bought 45 years ago, listening to the familiar sounds of the old structure settling around her. The house David and Linda wanted her to sell. The house that represented not just financial security, but a lifetime of memories. She thought about Henry's letter, about his warning to trust herself. She thought about the badge that had reduced her entire identity to her bank account. She thought about Linda calling her weak, too weak to stand up for herself. Maybe it was time to prove them wrong. The next morning, Margaret called Robert Chen.
I've decided, she told him. I want you to implement the protective clauses in Henry's will. I want David and Linda removed as beneficiaries. There was a pause. Margaret, are you certain? This isn't something that can be easily undone. I'm certain. They've shown me exactly what they think I'm worth, and it's not my love or my company or my wisdom. It's my money. Henry saw this coming, and he was right. I'll need you to document the recent incidents in writing.
And Margaret, you should be prepared for their reaction when they find out. I understand. Margaret spent the morning writing a detailed account of the wedding, the badge, the conversation about selling her house. As she wrote, patterns became clear that she'd been refusing to see. The way every phone call from Linda somehow turned into a discussion of their financial pressures. The way David had started talking about her money as if it were somehow already his. The way they'd begun treating her home like an asset to be liquidated, rather than a place where she lived and belonged. She was just finishing when Sarah called. "Grandmother, I wanted to apologize again about the badge. I've been thinking about it, and I realize this wasn't the first time something like this has happened." "What do you mean?" "Remember my college graduation party? Mom introduced you to her friends as the woman who made Sarah's education possible. Not as my grandmother, not as someone who had her own accomplishments. Just as the person who paid." Margaret did remember. At the time, she'd been touched that Linda acknowledged her contribution. Now she saw it differently. "And last Christmas," Sarah continued, "when we were all together, every conversation seemed to center around money somehow. Who was struggling, who needed help, what things cost, and you were always in the middle of it, being asked to solve everyone's financial problems. I didn't mind helping, but that's just it. It shouldn't always be your responsibility. You shouldn't be the family bank. You should be the family grandmother." After Sarah hung up, Margaret sat in her quiet house and made another decision. She called Michael. "How would you feel about having dinner here tomorrow night? I'd like to cook for you." "I'd love that, Grandma. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself. Oh, and Michael, I might have some things to tell you about your grandfather's will." The next evening, Margaret prepared Henry's favorite meal, pot roast with all the trimmings. It felt right, cooking for family who valued her for more than her bank balance. Michael arrived with flowers, daisies from the grocery store, simple and cheerful. "These reminded me of the ones in your garden," he said. They ate dinner and talked about normal things: Michael's job at the engineering firm, his girlfriend Emma, whom Margaret had met several times and liked enormously, the book club Margaret had joined at the library. Conversation that had nothing to do with money or what anyone needed or who should pay for what. Over dessert, Margaret told him about her meeting with Robert Chen about Henry's protective clauses and her decision to remove David and Linda from the will. Michael listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious as she explained. "So their share would come to me and Sarah?" he asked finally. "That's how Henry structured it, yes." Michael was quiet for a long time. "Grandma, are you sure about this? I'm not arguing against it, but Dad is still your son." I had been asking myself the same question. He is my son and I love him, but loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to treat you badly. It doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity and security for their comfort. What do you think will happen when they find out? I think they'll be very angry. I think they'll try to convince me I'm making a mistake. I think they'll tell me I'm being manipulated or that I'm not thinking clearly. And I think I'm finally thinking more clearly than I have in a long time. The confrontation came sooner than expected. Robert had called David and Linda to his office to discuss changes to estate planning documents. Margaret had insisted on being present. They arrived expecting, she realized, to be involved in planning her future, perhaps finalizing her move to a smaller place or discussing their role in managing her finances. Instead, Robert explained the protective clauses in Henry's will and the decision to implement them. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, Linda exploded. "This is ridiculous. You can't just cut us out because we care enough to have difficult conversations with you." "Difficult conversations?" Margaret said quietly. "Is that what you call publicly humiliating me and then demanding I sell my home?" "We never demanded anything," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We made suggestions. We expressed concerns. You called me selfish for not giving you more money." "You are being selfish." Linda stood up, her face flushed. "You're an old woman living alone in a house that's too big for you, sitting on money that could help your family, and you'd rather hoard it than share it." "I have shared it," Margaret said. For years, I've shared it. I've paid for cars and houses and vacations and college tuitions and business ventures and emergencies that weren't really emergencies. I've given and given and given, and it's never been enough. Because you're our family, David said. That's what family does. No, Margaret said, standing up herself. Family loves each other. Family respects each other. Family doesn't reduce each other to name tags that say, the old lady who pays for everything. That was a joke. It wasn't funny. Linda was pacing now, her composure completely gone. This is Michael, isn't it? He's been poisoning you against us, making you think we don't care about you. Michael has shown me more genuine care and respect in the past week than you've shown me in years. He's manipulating you. He's after your money just like… Linda stopped abruptly. Just like what? Margaret asked softly. Just like you? The words hung in the air. Robert looked stricken, as if finally understanding how far things had gone. Linda looked furious, as if she'd been cheated out of something that belonged to her. This isn't over, Linda said finally. We'll contest this. We'll prove you're not competent to make these decisions. Robert spoke for the first time since explaining the clauses. Mrs. Collins is completely competent, as any evaluation would show, and Mr. Collins' will was very specific about these contingencies. Any attempt to challenge Margaret's mental capacity would likely be seen as further evidence of the exploitative behavior the will was designed to prevent. David slumped in his chair. Mom, please, don't do this. We can work things out. Margaret looked at her son. Really looked at him. She could see the boy he'd been, the young man who'd brought her his problems and accepted her help with genuine gratitude. But she could also see the man he'd become, the one who'd learned to see her generosity as an entitlement rather than a gift. David, what's my favorite color? He blinked, thrown by the question. Your what? My favorite color. What is it? Blue? Purple. It's been purple for as long as you've known me. What's my middle name? Mom, this is ridiculous. What's my middle name, David? He looked helpless. Elizabeth? Rose, after my grandmother. When's my birthday? October 15th. I'll be 73 in 4 months. Margaret's voice remained calm, but each answer felt like a small knife to her heart. What did I do before I became a librarian? David looked to Linda for help, but she was staring at the floor. You taught school, Margaret continued when no answer came. 3rd grade for 12 years before you were born. I've mentioned it hundreds of times. I still get Christmas cards from those students. They're in their 50s now. Mom, I don't see what this has to do with… It has everything to do with everything. You don't know me, David. You know my bank account balance, but you don't know me. You don't know what I love or what I dream about or what I'm afraid of. You don't know that I still miss your father every single day, or that I volunteer at the animal shelter because being around creatures who just want love helps heal something in my heart. David's face was pale now. You don't know that I've been taking painting classes for 2 years, or that I'm pretty good at it. You don't know that I've been thinking about traveling, really traveling, not just the little trips your father and I took. You don't know that I have friends, a life, interests that have nothing to do with how much money I have or how I can spend it on you. Margaret stood up, feeling lighter than she had in years. You want to know what's truly heartbreaking? It's not that you see me as a bank account. It's that you've trained yourselves not to see anything else. Linda looked up, her anger replaced by something that might have been panic. Margaret, you're being dramatic. Of course we care about you as a person. When was the last time you called me, just to talk? When was the last time you asked how I was feeling, or what I was doing without it being a prelude to asking for something? The silence stretched uncomfortably. I can't remember either, Margaret said sadly. She gathered her purse and stood to leave. Robert, please proceed with the changes we discussed. Mom, wait, David jumped up. Look, maybe we've gotten focused on the wrong things, but we can change. We can do better. Margaret paused at the door. For a moment, she felt the familiar pull of her old pattern, the desire to smooth things over, to make everyone comfortable, to sacrifice her own needs for family peace. Instead, she thought about Henry's letter, about trust yourself. She said, "Perhaps you can change. I hope you do. But these changes to the will stand. If you can learn to see me as more than a source of money, if you can treat me with the respect and love I deserve, then we can rebuild our relationship. But my inheritance is no longer your incentive to try." The christening was held 2 months later in the same church where Margaret and Henry had been married, where they'd baptized their own children decades earlier. Margaret stood at the altar holding Emma, speaking the vows that promised to guide and support this child throughout her life. Afterward, at the reception Sarah and James had organized, Margaret found herself wearing a badge again. This one read Godmother in elegant script, and when someone asked her about the baby, they were asking about her role in Emma's life, not about who had paid for the celebration. Michael approached her near the end of the afternoon. "How are you feeling, Godmother?" "Blessed," Margaret said simply. "Completely blessed." "Any regrets?" Margaret looked around the room. Sarah and James were laughing with their friends. Michael was helping clear tables without being asked. Several of Margaret's own friends had come to celebrate. Eleanor from book club, Janet from the painting class, Dr. Martinez from the animal shelter. David and Linda were absent. They'd been invited, but had declined. Margaret suspected they found it too painful to attend family events where they were no longer the primary focus of her attention and resources. "No regrets," she said. "Well, one small one." "What's that?" "I wish I'd found the courage to set boundaries years ago. I wish I hadn't let things get so bad before I acted," Michael nodded. "Maybe that's Emma's gift to all of us. A fresh start." That evening, Margaret sat in her nursery, the room she'd prepared for when Emma came to visit, and wrote in the journal she'd started keeping since the wedding 6 months ago. She wrote about the christening, about the joy of holding her great-granddaughter, about the satisfaction of being valued for her presence rather than her presence. She also wrote about David, because even now, she missed him. She missed the son he'd been, the relationship they'd had before it became transactional. She hoped that someday he might find his way back to valuing people over money, relationships over resources. But she was no longer willing to enable his journey by sacrificing her own dignity. Margaret closed the journal and looked around the room she'd decorated with soft yellow walls and white furniture, with stuffed animals and children's books. This room represented hope. Hope that Emma would grow up in a family that valued love over money, that measured worth in hugs rather than bank transfers. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she could see a familiar figure on her porch. David stood there alone, looking older than his 51 years old. Margaret opened the door, but didn't immediately invite him in. "Hi, Mom." "Hello." "David, I was wondering if we could talk. Really talk." "About what?" "About how badly I've messed this up. About how I lost sight of what really matters." David's voice cracked slightly. "About how I turned my mother into a bank account and forgot she was a person." For a moment, Margaret felt the old familiar tug to comfort him, to make it easy, to say it was all fine, and invite him in for dinner and pretend nothing had changed. Instead, she stepped outside and sat on the porch swing, gesturing for him to take the chair across from her. "Tell me about your favorite memory of me," she said quietly. David blinked, clearly not expecting the request. He was quiet for a long time, thinking. "The summer I was 12, you taught me to drive in this Sears parking lot. It was just the two of us, and we spent the whole afternoon there. You were so patient, even when I kept stalling the car. And afterward, we got ice cream, and you told me stories about when you were learning to drive. I remember. You were so determined to reach the pedals properly. You made me feel like I could do anything that day. You believed in me completely. I haven't felt like that in a long time. Someone believed in me for who I was, not what I could provide or achieve. And how do you think I've been feeling, David? He looked down at his hands. We only cared about what you could provide. We forgot you were a person with feelings and dreams and worth beyond what you could give us. Margaret rocked gently on the swing. Why are you here tonight?
Because Linda left me. Margaret's heart clenched, despite everything. Oh, David. She said I was weak. That I let you manipulate me out of my inheritance. She said if I wasn't going to fight for what was rightfully ours, she was done. David looked up and Margaret could see tears in his eyes. The thing is, Mom, sitting in that empty house tonight, I realized she was right about one thing. I am weak, but not for the reason she thinks. What do you mean? I'm weak because I let money become more important than people. I'm weak because I forgot that you raised me to be better than that. I'm weak because I hurt someone I love for something as meaningless as money. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the sun set behind the oak trees that lined Margaret's street. I don't know how to fix this, David said finally. I don't know how to prove to you that I can be the son you deserve. Margaret stopped rocking. David, I need you to understand something. I don't need you to prove anything to me. I need you to decide what kind of person you want to be and then be that person consistently. Not because of what you might inherit, but because that's who you choose to be. The will stays as it is, Margaret said firmly. This isn't about earning your way back into an inheritance. This is about whether we can build a relationship based on love and respect rather than expectations and obligations. David nodded slowly. I think I understand. Do you? Because if you're here hoping that being a good son for a while will get you back into the will, then you're still missing the point. I'm here because I miss my mother. And for the first time in years, Margaret heard genuine emotion in his voice, rather than calculation. I'm here because I realized that even if you left everything to charity tomorrow, I'd still want a relationship with you. I'm here because I finally understand that having you in my life is worth more than anything you could leave me when you're gone. Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of pain she'd been carrying for months. That's a start, David. What happens now? Margaret considered the question. Now you show me over time that you mean what you say. You call me to see how I'm doing, not to ask for anything. You learn my favorite color and my middle name and what I'm passionate about. You treat me like someone you love, not like someone you're trying to manage. And if I do that, if I prove I can be better, then we'll have a relationship worth having. Not because of money, but because we choose to love and respect each other. David stood to leave, then paused. Mom, your favorite color is purple. Your middle name is Rose. And I know you volunteer at the animal shelter because you've always loved creatures that need taking care of. I smiled. It's a start, David. After he left, Margaret remained on the porch swing thinking about second chances and the courage it takes to change. She wasn't naive. She knew that rebuilding trust would take time and that David would struggle to maintain this new perspective. But for the first time in months, she felt hope about their relationship. More importantly, she felt proud of herself for not sacrificing her boundaries for the comfort of easy reconciliation. The old Margaret might have welcomed him back immediately, grateful that he'd returned and willing to pretend nothing had happened. This Margaret required more, not out of cruelty, but out of hard-won wisdom about the difference between love and enabling. Inside, she made herself a cup of tea and called Michael to tell him about David's visit. How do you feel about it? Cautiously optimistic, Margaret said, and proud of myself for not making it easy for him. Grandpa would be proud too. Margaret smiled, thinking about Henry's letter.
about his faith in her strength. I think he would be. A year later, Margaret stood in her kitchen preparing Thanksgiving dinner for a smaller but more genuine gathering than she'd hosted in years. Sarah and James were coming with Emma, now a delightful toddler who called her Gigi. Michael was bringing his girlfriend Emma. Yes, they'd have two Emmas at dinner, which never failed to amuse everyone. David was coming too. Over the past year, he'd slowly, consistently shown that he meant what he said that night on the porch. He called weekly just to talk. He remembered her birthday and brought her flowers for no reason. He'd started asking about her painting and her volunteer work, and actually listened to the answers. The inheritance remained unchanged. Margaret had been clear about that from the beginning. But their relationship had deepened in ways that had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with genuine care and respect. Linda had indeed left David and was now living with a man she'd met at the country club, someone whose family wealth was more accessible than David's promised inheritance had been. David seemed relieved rather than heartbroken by her departure. As Margaret stirred the gravy, she reflected on the strange gift that awful wedding badge had given her. By reducing her to her worst fear, being seen as nothing but a source of money, it had forced her to recognize her own worth and demand that others recognize it too. The doorbell rang, and Margaret opened it to find David holding a bottle of wine and a small wrapped package. "Happy Thanksgiving, Mom." "Happy Thanksgiving, sweetheart. Come in." As David helped her finish the dinner preparations, Margaret marveled at how normal it felt to have him there, working beside her, talking about Emma's latest words and his job and her recent painting. This was what family was supposed to feel like: comfortable, supportive, based on love rather than obligation. When the others arrived and they all sat down to dinner, Margaret looked around the table at these people who valued her for herself. As they went around sharing what they were grateful for, Margaret's turn came last. "I'm grateful," she said, "for the courage to demand better, for the people in my life who see me as more than what I can provide, and for learning that it's never too late to set boundaries, to change patterns, to insist on being treated with dignity." She raised her glass, to being known and loved for who we are, not what we have. "To being known and loved," the table echoed. Later, as Margaret tucked Emma into the portable crib in the nursery, the little girl grabbed her finger and smiled. "Gigi," Emma said, one of her few clear words. "That's right, sweetheart. Gigi, not the old lady who pays for everything, not a bank account with legs, just Gigi. Beloved, valued, known." Margaret kissed Emma's forehead and turned off the light, leaving the door cracked open just enough to hear if she needed anything. In the hallway, she paused to look at a new photo Sarah had given her, a family picture from Emma's first birthday party. In it, Margaret was holding Emma while surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her. She looked happy in the photo, more than happy. She looked like herself. For the first time in years, Margaret Collins was exactly where she belonged, in her own home, with her own life, surrounded by people who loved her for all the right reasons. The house that David and Linda had wanted her to sell still stood strong around her, filled with laughter and memories and the promise of more good times to come. And in her jewelry box upstairs, tucked away in a small drawer, was a different kind of keepsake. That awful wedding badge that had changed everything. She'd kept it not as a reminder of hurt, but as a reminder of her own strength. A reminder that she'd had the courage to look at an unacceptable situation and say no more. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives become the doorways to our best ones. Margaret had walked through that doorway and found herself on the other side, whole and valued and free. The old lady who paid for everything was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew exactly what she was worth.